You can tell a lot about a person by what they choose to destroy when nobody's looking. I heard the water before I saw it. Not rain. Not a sprinkler. A hard, wasteful roar, like somebody had turned a creek loose in my backyard before sunrise. I came out the back door in my work boots, the screen slamming behind me, and the cool morning air hit my face carrying that sharp wet smell of concrete, metal, and soaked red clay. My 3 rainwater tanks stood against the fence line like gutted animals, their side valves wide open, thousands of gallons pouring out across the gravel and running useless into the storm drain at the edge of the alley. The sound was wrong. Water's supposed to mean life where I live. That morning, it sounded like theft. I stopped dead on the patio, one hand still wrapped around my coffee mug, and just stared as months of careful planning, every storm I'd collected, every drop I'd saved through a dry Texas spring, rushed away in silver sheets under the first gray light of dawn. And leaning against the fence in a pressed lavender tracksuit like she was inspecting landscaping at a country club, Brenda Whitmore watched it happen with her arms folded and that thin, polished smile she wore whenever she thought she had won something. "I told you those ugly things had to go," she said. Her voice came over the hiss of water like a knife drawn slow across glass. "This neighborhood is not some rural science project, Ethan." I set the coffee down on the patio rail so carefully it almost made me angrier. "My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 41 years old, born and raised in Travis County, and I build things for a living. Decks, pergolas, trim work, garden beds, fences. If it's wood, steel, concrete, or something a man can fix with a level and a wrench, I've probably made a paycheck on it. I'm not loud. I'm not political. I don't spend my evenings peeking through blinds to see whose grass is a half-inch too tall. I bought my little house in Willow Creek Estates because it had a decent workshop out back, enough side yard for raised beds, and just enough peace to think. Or at least that's what I thought before Brenda decided my property offended her sense of order. She was the HOA president, of course. White SUV. White teeth. White clipboard. The kind of woman who said community values when she meant control. She'd been after those tanks for weeks, mailing violation letters, circling my house during her evening walks, even taking pictures from the sidewalk like she was building a criminal case. Never mind that the tanks were permitted. Never mind that they were screened behind cedar slats I'd stained myself. Never mind that half the flowers planted around the entrance sign owed their survival to the same conservation rebate program she bragged about in HOA newsletters. Brenda didn't care about any of that. What bothered her was simple. The tanks were useful. They were visible. And they were mine. I walked across the wet gravel, feeling the cold splash against my jeans, and reached down to shut the first valve. The brass handle was slick, recently turned. Then the second. Then the third. My fingers came away muddy and cold. Behind me, Brenda gave a little laugh through her nose. "You should thank me," she said. "Stagnant water attracts pests. I probably saved you from a fine." I looked past her toward the end of the block, where the community garden sat behind the old brick church lot, still dark in the morning haze. Raised beds. Tomato stakes. Cucumber trellises. A painted sign made by local kids. In 6 hours, volunteers would show up with gloves and buckets expecting another Saturday harvest. They had no idea the tanks Brenda had just emptied were the only reason those beds were still green. By 7:30, the sun had climbed high enough to turn the wet gravel into sticky red paste, and I was standing in the middle of my backyard with a shop towel over one shoulder, staring at those tanks like I was looking at 3 empty ribs in a chest that used to breathe. People hear rainwater system and picture some off-grid fantasy, like I was out there pretending to be a pioneer with barrels and a dream. That was not what those tanks were. They were food. They were insurance. They were the difference between a garden making it through August or cooking alive under 103 degrees of Texas heat. I built that system 2 years earlier after the city announced conservation incentives during a drought cycle that had everybody pretending to care until their own lawns turned green again. I poured the pads myself on a Saturday in June. Set the anchors. Ran the gutters into a first flush diverter. Installed screened inlets, overflow control, and a transfer pump with a timer I wired into a weatherproof box under the eaves. Nothing illegal. Nothing sloppy. I pulled permits, passed inspection, and kept every receipt in a binder thick enough to stop a door. The cedar privacy screen around the tanks cost me 3 full weekends and a lower back that complained every time the weather changed. I stained every board by hand until the wood matched the fence and the raised planters along the side yard. From the street, you barely noticed the setup unless you were looking for it, and Brenda Whitmore had been looking for it from the day I finished it. The reason I built it had a name and a place. St. Luke Community Garden sat half a block from my house on a sliver of church land the city had almost sold for overflow parking 5 years earlier. Instead, the pastor let neighbors clean it up, frame out beds, and start planting. At first it was just herbs, tomatoes, and peppers for a few retirees who missed having real soil under their fingernails. Then the pandemic hit, grocery prices climbed, and suddenly that little patch of ground mattered. Single moms came by on Thursdays. Older folks on fixed incomes filled cloth bags with collards and squash. Kids from the elementary school painted signs and learned the difference between mint and basil. The place smelled like warm dirt, tomato leaves, and hose water in summer, and every time I stepped through that gate after work, the noise in my head dropped about 10 notches. What most people in Willow Creek did not know was that the garden had no dedicated irrigation line. Never had. The church spigot was old, weak, and unreliable, and city watering restrictions got tighter every year. So when the pastor asked if I knew a way to help, I did the math. My roof square footage, average rainfall, tank capacity, pump rate, seasonal usage. I built the system on my property because I had the space, then ran a concealed hose connection through a locked service line along the side fence that fed portable cistern totes on harvest days. Quiet, legal, efficient. The kind. A fix that keeps things alive without making a speech about it. I never put up a sign with my name on it. Never asked anybody to clap. But every cucumber vine climbing that trellis and every fat red tomato warming in the sun had some part of that water in it. Brenda did not know any of that because Brenda did not ask questions unless she already thought she knew the answer. To her, the tanks were ugly. To me, they were what kept a dozen raised beds from turning into cracked boxes of dust by the 4th of July. And standing there with mud drying on my boots and the last of the runoff disappearing into the drain, I realized something cold and steady. She had not just emptied my tanks. She had taken a swing at every person who depended on what they fed. By noon, word had started moving through Willow Creek the way it always did, not openly, not honestly, but through trimmed hedges, half-closed garage doors, and those little clusters of neighbors pretending to check the mail while they traded pieces of somebody else's morning. Brenda Whitmore knew how to use that better than anybody. She never raised her voice if she could help it. She did not need to. She had built herself into the kind of neighborhood force that made people lower theirs. 52 years old, real estate hair frozen into place like bad weather could not touch it, pearl earrings at 8 in the morning, pressed workout clothes that looked like they had never seen an actual workout, and that white Lexus SUV washed so often it reflected the sky sharper than some lakes do. Brenda did not walk through Willow Creek. She patrolled it. Clipboard tucked against one arm, phone in the other hand, eyes moving over mailbox posts, porch lights, basketball hoops, lawn edges. She carried herself like the whole subdivision was a showroom and every house was supposed to match the version in her head. The first time we met, she smiled so wide it almost hid the calculation in her eyes. I had just moved in and was unloading lumber from my truck when she came over across the cul-de-sac in wedge sandals that clicked against the pavement like a metronome counting down patience. She welcomed me to the neighborhood, handed me a printed copy of the bylaws already highlighted in yellow, and told me Willow Creek was a place where people took pride in appearances. Then she looked past me at the stack of cedar boards in my driveway and added, "Just make sure your projects stay tasteful." I remember the smell of sawdust still clinging to my shirt, the heat bouncing off the concrete, and the little pause before that last word. Tasteful. Brenda loved words like that. Flexible words. Respectable words. Words that sounded harmless until you noticed they only ever pointed in one direction, toward whatever she wanted. At first it was small stuff. A notice about my trash cans being visible 30 minutes too long after pickup. A warning because my work trailer sat in the driveway overnight before a deck install across town. An email saying the stain on my front fence was not on the approved color chart, even though it matched the original cedar almost exactly. I answered every one of them the same way, calm and documented. Timestamps. Photos. City code. HOA section numbers. I never gave her a reason to say I was combative, and that seemed to bother her more than if I had shouted on the sidewalk. Brenda liked easy targets. She liked people who got flustered, apologized too quickly, or paid fines just to make her go away. What she could not stand was someone who knew the difference between a rule and her opinion. The tanks pushed her over the edge because they exposed that difference every time she drove by. She called them industrial, then agricultural, then non-conforming visual equipment. One week she claimed they threatened property values. The next week she said they created mosquito risk, even though every inlet was screened tighter than a window in January. At an HOA meeting in the clubhouse, with stale coffee burning on the warmer and lemon air freshener fighting a losing battle against old carpet, she actually pointed at a picture of my backyard and told the room, "We cannot allow individual homeowners to turn Willow Creek into a utility yard." A few people nodded because nodding at Brenda was easier than arguing. A few stared down at their paper agendas. But I noticed something then. She was not angry because the tanks were dangerous. She was angry because they worked. Because every dry week they kept something alive that she did not control. And people like Brenda can tolerate almost anything except useful things they did not approve first. Brenda did not stop with letters. People like her never do when paperwork fails to produce surrender. They escalate in cleaner shoes. By that Monday afternoon, she had moved from complaints to enforcement theater, and Willow Creek was small enough that she knew exactly when to stage it. Right after school let out. Right when people started pulling into driveways. Right when an audience could form without looking like one. I was in my side yard replacing a walkboard on a raised bed when I heard the slow crawl of her Lexus, the engine barely above a purr, followed by the sharper rattle of a golf cart behind her. HOA maintenance. 2 men in tan polos. One of them carrying a roll of orange tags. The other holding a cordless drill like they were about to improve something that was not theirs. The smell of sun-baked cedar and compost hung in the air, heavy and sweet, and I remember wiping sweat off the back of my neck with the heel of my hand before I stood up. Brenda stepped out smiling, sunglasses on, not because the light was bright, but because she liked hiding her eyes when she was about to lie. "Good afternoon, Ethan," she said, like we were meeting by chance at a farmer's market. "I am here to document non-compliant exterior utility structures pending removal." Pending removal. She said it with the same tone a dentist uses to mention a root canal. Then she handed me a notice printed on HOA letterhead, thick paper, fresh ink, all confidence and no authority. 24 hours to remedy visual nuisance conditions. Fine schedule attached. Failure to comply may result in corrective action by the association. I read it once, then again, and I could feel that old familiar heat gathering behind my ribs, not explosive, just steady, the kind that makes your voice quieter instead of louder. "Those tanks are permitted," I said. "You already have the city paperwork." Brenda tilted her head. City approval does not override community standards. There it was. The line she always used when she wanted private preference to sound like law. I reached into the back pocket of my jeans, pulled out my phone, and opened the folder I had been building on her for months. Permit number. Inspection certificate. Rebate approval. Screenshots of the HOA landscaping clause she kept twisting into shapes it was never meant to hold. I showed her every piece, one by one, while the maintenance men stood there pretending not to be uncomfortable. A cicada buzzed from the live oak over the fence. Somewhere down the block, a garage door groaned open. Brenda barely glanced at the documents. That told me everything. This was never about whether she was right. It was about whether I would yield. Visual harmony matters, she said, tapping the notice with one manicured nail. Residents have expressed concern. Residents. That magical word tyrants use when they need a crowd without names. I looked past her toward the street. Mrs. Alvarez was watering her front flower bed slower than anybody had ever watered anything in Texas. The Harris boy sat on a bicycle at the curb, pretending to fix his shoelace. Everybody knew. Nobody wanted to be next. Then Brenda turned and nodded to the maintenance crew. Go ahead and tag them. That was the moment something settled in me. One of the men took 2 steps toward my fence line with an orange sticker in hand, and I said, very evenly, you put anything on my property, and I call the city code office before your drill battery dies. He stopped. The other one looked at Brenda, then at me, then back at the tanks. I could see the calculation in his face. Regular paycheck. Irregular situation. Brenda's smile tightened just enough to show teeth. You are being unnecessarily difficult. No, I said. I am being documented. The word landed. She hated that word because it belonged to facts, and facts do not flutter when she talks. For a second the whole little performance stalled in the heat. Then she took the notice back from my hand, folded it once, and gave me a look so cold it could have frosted glass. This is not over, she said. And as her golf cart escort rolled away and the Lexus drifted after it, I noticed one of the maintenance men glance back at the tanks, then toward the church garden down the block, like maybe he was starting to understand what Brenda still did not. She was not just trying to remove an eyesore. She was reaching for a system she could not control, and when people like Brenda fail in public, they usually come back when nobody is watching. The garden started showing it by Tuesday. Not all at once. That would have been easier somehow, cleaner, like a storm taking a roof in one loud minute. This was slower. Meaner. By 8 in the morning, the top layer of soil in the tomato beds had already lost that dark, healthy color and gone pale at the edges, like coffee grounds drying out in a paper filter. The cucumber leaves that had been broad and cool the day before were curling inward, trying to save themselves from a sun that had not even reached full strength yet. I was there before most of the volunteers arrived, hauling 5-gallon buckets from my outdoor spigot and stretching every foot of hose I owned across the church lot, trying to fake a water supply with pressure that pulsed like an old man's heartbeat. The air smelled like hot cedar mulch, dust, and that faint green scent plants give off right before they start giving up. I could hear traffic on the main road, a lawn crew 2 blocks over, the metal clink of my own hose nozzle hitting the side of a bed as I moved too fast. Nothing about it felt dramatic. That was the worst part. Gardens do not scream. They just fail quietly in front of you. Around 9, Mrs. Alvarez came through the side gate carrying her canvas produce bag and stopped short when she saw me kneeling by the pepper beds with wet knees and mud on both hands. Mr. Ethan, she said, softer than usual, what happened? I looked over at the tanks in my mind before I answered. Empty. Useless. Drained down a storm gutter because a woman with a clipboard could not stand the sight of something practical. Water issue, I said. I am working on it. She nodded, but her eyes traveled across the rows and she understood more than I said. An hour later, the elementary school garden group showed up in matching green shirts, all chatter and sneakers and little plastic trowels, ready for their Saturday lesson that had been rescheduled because of weather. Their teacher, Miss Kendra, took one look at the drooping squash vines and lowered her voice before the kids could hear panic in it. Can we still do something today? She asked me. That question hit harder than any HOA notice ever had. Because what do you say when the thing you built to help people has been kneecapped by somebody who has never once dirted her hands? I gave the children the healthiest corner left, let them harvest basil and marigold seeds, and kept smiling through it while my shirt stuck to my back and the sun climbed another 10 degrees. Every few minutes I checked the hose flow like I could bully physics into mercy. By noon, the church spigot had gone from weak to insulting. It sputtered, coughed, and gave me a thread of water not worth the rubber it traveled through. Pastor Raymond stood beside me under the shade of the fellowship hall awning, his collar damp at the neck, looking out over the beds with his hands folded tight. "We can buy a few watering totes," he said. "Maybe get donations." I appreciated the instinct, but I had already done the math. Too late for some plants. Too slow for the rest. The system Brenda emptied was not decorative backup. It was the backbone. And right on schedule, like a bad smell finding the room again, Brenda appeared at the far sidewalk just after lunch in a sleeveless white blouse and oversized sunglasses, carrying a stainless steel tumbler and that expression people wear when they want credit for staying calm in a mess they caused. She did not come into the garden. She stood outside the fence where she could still look involved without risking dirt on her shoes. "Such a shame," she said when I walked toward the gate. "I suppose homemade utility systems are not always reliable." I could taste iron at the back of my tongue. "You opened those valves," I said. Her smile barely moved. "Ethan, if you are going to make accusations, I hope you have something better than emotion." Then she glanced at the wilted rose behind me, and for 1 second I saw it. Not concern. Not guilt. Satisfaction. She thought the dying garden proved her point. She thought if the plants went brown enough, people would forget the water and blame the man who tried to save it. That night, after the heat finally let go of the sidewalks and the neighborhood settled into its usual soundtrack of distant televisions, barking dogs, and sprinklers clicking on in yards that had no business wasting city water, I went back to the tanks with a flashlight and a legal pad. Anger is loud at first, but if you let it cool, it gets useful. The brass valve handles still held faint scrape marks where somebody had turned them fast and hard, not the slow, careful motion of a homeowner checking a fitting, but the rough twist of someone doing a job they did not understand and did not care about. The gravel beneath the spigots had been gouged by runoff channels that had dried into stiff red ridges, and one of the cedar slats near the service side had a fresh scuff low to the ground, the kind a boot leaves when somebody braces for leverage. I crouched there in the beam of the flashlight, the smell of damp soil and sun-cooked plastic still hanging around the tanks, and started writing down everything I saw. Time. Position. Valve angle. Ground condition. The discipline of it calmed me. By 10 o'clock I was in my workshop with the ceiling fan rattling overhead, my laptop open, and every document I had ever saved on the system spread across the bench beside my tape measure, drill bits, and a half-finished cedar planter box. Most people think the twist in stories like this comes from some hidden power nobody saw coming. It usually does not. Most of the time, the real twist is paperwork. Boring, stubborn, beautiful paperwork. I pulled up the city conservation rebate file first, then the installation inspection, then the water usage plan I had submitted the year before when St. Luke applied for neighborhood sustainability support. That was when I found the email chain again, buried 3 folders down, the one I had not needed in months because everything had been working so smoothly I forgot how important the wording was. The garden was not just informally using my rain system. It had been listed in the program file as an approved auxiliary irrigation source for a registered community food project. My tanks, my pump, my transfer line, all of it documented as part of the garden's drought contingency plan. I sat back on the stool and read it twice, then a third time, listening to the hum of the fan and the occasional ping of cooling metal from the tools on the wall. Brenda had not just meddled with a private setup she thought looked ugly. She had interfered with a documented resource tied to a public-facing community program with city reporting, donor logs, and crop distribution records. That changed the shape of everything. Then I checked my exterior camera system. I had installed cameras after the second round of HOA nonsense, not because I expected a mover-level confession, but because people behave differently when you can prove what they did at 6:47 in the morning. The backyard camera did not catch the valve handles directly because of the cedar screen angle, but it caught enough. At 5:12 that morning, before sunrise had fully broken, a golf cart rolled through the alley behind my fence. HOA maintenance. Same beige cart. Same utility rack on the back. A man stepped out in a tan polo, disappeared along the service gap beside the cedar screen, and 30 seconds later the first stream of water burst into frame from under the tanks. Then another. Then all three. And standing at the alley mouth with a stainless steel tumbler in one hand and her phone in the other, Brenda Whitmore watched the whole thing like a foreman checking a demolition. I froze the frame on her face. Even grainy in low light, there she was. Calm. Certain. Wrong. By midnight, I had a folder on my desktop labeled everything. Video clips. Permit scans. Program emails. Photos of the garden before and after. A spreadsheet estimating crop loss by bed. Notes from Pastor Raymond. A list of volunteers who could testify the system had been feeding the place for months. Brenda thought she had created a failure. What she had actually done was leave a paper trail, a digital trail, and a witness trail wide enough to drive that white Lexus straight through. The next morning, I did not go door to door and I did not post anything online. That is the mistake people make when they are angry. They rush to the loud part before they build the solid part. Brenda was counting on that. She wanted me emotional, public, easy to dismiss. The kind of man she could describe at the next HOA meeting with one hand on her chest and that wounded little frown she used whenever she needed control to look like concern. So I stayed quiet. Quiet enough that by breakfast she probably thought I was scrambling. Quiet enough that by lunch she probably believed the garden would take the blame for being fragile and I would take the blame for building something she could call reckless. Instead, I spent the day turning evidence into structure. I printed every permit and every inspection. I highlighted the city sustainability file showing my rain system listed as the approved backup source for St. Luke Community Garden. I copied the email from the neighborhood grant coordinator thanking us for reducing summer water demand. I added before and after photos of the beds, one set green and thriving, the next set curled and stressed less than 48 hours after the tanks were drained. Then I drove to the church office and sat with Pastor Raymond at a folding table that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old coffee. He read the documents in silence, his glasses low on his nose, then looked up at me with the kind of disappointment that is somehow heavier than anger. She knew this water served the garden, he asked. Maybe not at first, I said. But she knew after she saw me hauling water all Saturday and still stood outside the fence pretending this was a systems issue. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. Then he reached for the volunteer logbook and slid it toward me. Names. Dates. Harvest weights. Distribution notes. Which families picked up produce. Which school groups helped plant. Which weeks needed extra irrigation because of heat advisories. It was all there in black ink and neat columns. Not drama. Not opinion. Community memory. By afternoon I had 3 written statements. One from Pastor Raymond confirming the tanks had supported the garden through drought weeks. One from Miss Kendra, the school teacher, describing the children arriving to find damaged beds and cancelled watering lessons. And one from Mrs. Alvarez, who wrote in careful block letters that she had relied on the garden for fresh vegetables while living on a fixed income. I also called the City Neighborhood Partnerships office and asked a very simple question in a very calm voice. If a documented auxiliary water source tied to a registered community garden was intentionally disabled by a third party, who needed to be informed? The woman on the phone did not answer right away. I could hear keyboard clicks, the soft rustle of paper, then her tone changed. Sharper. More official. She gave me a name, an email, and told me to send everything before close of business. I did. Video clip. Permit packet. Witness statements. Photo timeline. Crop loss estimate. Subject line plain as a hammer. Meanwhile, Brenda kept walking around Willow Creek like she had improved something. That evening I saw her outside the clubhouse pinning notices to the community board for Thursday's monthly meeting. Landscaping compliance review. Exterior standards discussion. Supplemental assessment vote. She had built herself a stage. She just did not realize I was bringing the lights. I looked at that agenda under the yellow porch bulbs, smelled fresh-cut grass drifting over from the common area, and felt something settle deep and certain in my chest. I was done defending the tanks like they were just mine. By Thursday night, Brenda was going to learn what happens when you mistake a neighborhood resource for a personal nuisance and a quiet man for an easy one. Thursday night, the Willow Creek clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee, lemon cleaner, and the kind of nervous quiet people bring into a room when they know something unpleasant is about to happen but have not decided which side of it they are on yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with that flat, unforgiving hum that makes everybody look a little more tired and a little less certain. Folding chairs filled up fast. Homeowners with crossed arms. A few board members shuffling printed agendas. Mrs. Alvarez in her Sunday cardigan even though it was still warm outside. Pastor Raymond near the back with a manila folder tucked under one arm. Miss Kendra sitting stiff and straight beside two parents from the school garden group. And at the front of the room, under the framed subdivision map and the fake ficus tree no one had dusted in years, Brenda Whitmore arranged her papers with the calm precision of a woman who still believed the room belonged to her. She opened the meeting with her usual voice, smooth and practiced, thanking everyone for attending, talking about neighborhood standards and preserving property values like she was reciting from a script she had used so many times it felt holy to her. Then she moved to exterior compliance. My name came up in the third sentence. Certain unauthorized utility structures, she said, glancing down at her notes, have created visual inconsistency and potential maintenance concerns. She did not say tanks. She did not say garden. She did not say water. That was Brenda all over. She liked to bury the truth under cleaner words and hope nobody dug it back up. When she finished, she invited comments with a little nod that said she expected silence. Instead, I stood up. I had my binder in one hand and a thumb drive in the other, and I could feel every eye in the room turn before I even spoke. I have a comment, I said. My voice came out level, not loud, just clear enough that nobody had to lean in. Those structures are permitted rainwater tanks tied to a documented irrigation backup for St. Luke Community Garden. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just enough. A rustle of paper. Somebody uncrossing their arms. Brenda gave a tight smile and said, "That is your characterization." That was when I handed a copy of the city file to each board member. Permit approvals. Conservation rebate. Sustainability registration. Auxiliary irrigation designation. Then I asked the clubhouse manager to switch the wall monitor from the agenda slideshow to the input port. Brenda started to object, but one of the board members, a quiet accountant named Doug Mercer who had spent the last 2 years nodding through meetings like a hostage with homeowner dues, said, "Let him finish." So I did. The video came up grainy and grey in the early morning light, but clear enough for everyone to see the HOA maintenance cart in the alley, the worker stepping through the service gap, the first burst of water shooting from beneath the tanks, and Brenda standing there with that stainless steel tumbler in her hand like she was supervising landscaping. Nobody said a word at first. Then somebody in the back whispered, "Oh my God." Pastor Raymond stood and read his statement. Miss Kendra read hers. Mrs. Alvarez did not need to read anything. She just held up her produce bag and said, "That water helped feed people." Brenda tried to recover. She said she had acted on pest concerns. She said she did not understand the tank served a community resource. She said maintenance had made an operational judgment. But the room had already turned. You could feel it. The air changed. The fake calm snapped. Questions started coming from every side, quick and sharp and impossible to smooth over. Who authorized the crew? Why there was no notice? Why a private system tied to a registered garden was touched at all? Why she kept calling it visual blight when the document said otherwise? And for the first time since I moved into Willow Creek, Brenda Whitmore looked like what she really was without the clipboard, without the bylaws, without the little kingdom of silence she had built around herself. Just a woman in a bright clubhouse with too many witnesses and nowhere left to hide. By the end of that meeting, Brenda was no longer running it. She was surviving it. There is a sound people make when power leaves a room, and it is not dramatic. It is quieter than that. It is the scrape of folding chairs as people lean forward for the first time. It is the dry turn of paper as board members stop pretending they have not read what is right in front of them. It is the little crack in somebody's voice when they realize the rules they used to control everyone else have finally circled back around to them. Doug Mercer asked for a recess, but nobody really moved. 2 of the board members huddled over the permit packet. Pastor Raymond spoke with the city representative on speakerphone from the back hallway, and every few seconds the word documented drifted into the room like a gavel strike. Brenda tried one last time to reclaim the air. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said the maintenance contractor had acted under General Beautification Authority. She said she had only been protecting neighborhood standards. But those words had lost their shine. Once people see the mechanism underneath, the performance stops working. The vote came 20 minutes later. First, an immediate halt on any enforcement action against my property. Then a formal censure entered into the HOA minutes. Then suspension of Brenda's authority pending review of misuse of association resources. The third vote was the one that really landed. The board approved reimbursement for the damaged garden beds, replacement water delivery, and restoration costs, funded from the discretionary landscaping budget Brenda had used for 3 years like it was a private purse. You could actually hear a few people exhale when that passed. Not because it was generous. Because it was fair. And fairness had been in short supply around Willow Creek for a long time. Over the next 10 days, the neighborhood looked different to me, even though the streets and roofs and trimmed lawns stayed exactly the same. A contractor delivered 2 temporary water totes to St. Luke by Monday morning. Volunteers I had never seen at the garden before showed up in work gloves and ball caps carrying mulch, compost, and replacement seedlings. Mrs. Alvarez brought sweet tea in a cooler. The Harris boy, who used to hover at the edge of everything like he was afraid of being noticed, spent 3 hours helping me reset drip lines. Miss Kendra's students painted new signs for the herb beds. One of them painted a blue water drop with a smile on it, which would have been corny if it had not felt earned. I rebuilt the tank station that same week, only better. Heavier lock housings. Steel valve covers. A higher cedar screen with a hinge service panel only I could open. I added a simple plaque by the side gate, routed into a piece of white oak and sealed against the weather. It read, "Rain feeds this garden." Nothing fancy. Nothing angry. Just true. As for Brenda, she resigned before the review finished. No farewell email. No graceful speech. Her name disappeared from the monthly newsletter like it had been scrubbed with bleach. People still saw her around, of course. At the mailbox kiosk. In the parking lot by the clubhouse. Sliding through the neighborhood in that white Lexus a little slower than before. But the smile was gone. So was the certainty. Nobody stopped to chat. Nobody asked her opinion on fence stains or mailbox posts. Turns out authority dries up fast when people learn it was only ever borrowed. A month later, I stood at the garden just after sunrise, hose in hand, watching the first full watering cycle run off the restored system. The tanks gurgled softly as the pump kicked on. The beds were green again. Tomato vines climbing. Basil thick and fragrant. Squash blossoms opening gold in the morning light.